Good morning and welcome everybody to today's Wellness Wise webinar. My name is Katrina Walton and I'm founder and director of Wellness Designs, a boutique workplace wellness consultancy business, and we specialise in strategic consultancy, speaking and training services and helping organisations ultimately create healthy, safe and high-performing organisations. It's great to see such a great range of attendees today across Australia, New Zealand and also North America, and a range of industries including government, consultants, utilities, health and aged care, telecommunications and also transport. So really looking forward to getting things underway. I have the great pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for today's session, Mr. Geoff Pearman from Partners in Change. And Geoff is one of our highly valued associates. Now, Geoff is a thought leader in age and work, and he has a trans-Tasman consultancy and has over the past 5 years worked with over 80 employers to develop strategies and action plans. Now, Geoff has a background in social work, adult education and management, and he is also author of the book Doing It Differently, Life and Work After 50. The opportunity to submit some text questions throughout the webinar for Geoff, so we'll hold that off to the end, and you'll find a Q&A box on your navigation bar, which will be able to type in those questions, and like I said, we'll look to those questions at the end of the session. At the end of the webinar as well, you'll also be sent a link to a brief survey, and we greatly appreciate you taking 2 minutes to complete that survey and let us know how you found the webinar, together also with what other topics you might like to see as part of this series. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Geoff and welcome him again to the webinar.
Yeah, really looking forward to talking with you this morning about a subject that's becoming increasingly important in the workplace, and that's what are your mature age employees looking for from the workplace. I've come to this, I guess, as Katrina said, from a background in social work and working in organisations, and my particular focus is helping organisations adapt to this change that's happening now in organisations. So it's very, very timely that we're sitting here today talking, given two things that actually have happened over the last month. Here in Australia, which is where I am at the moment, on Sunday evening, 60 Minutes ran a program entitled Retire or Work Till You Drop. And the proposition that was put there was, in actual fact, the whole concept of retirement for quite different reasons, that in 20 years' time we'd look back and the whole notion of retirement would be seen as a lovely 20th century concept. So today, what I want to do is unpack this changing world and what's happening. And first of all, I want to talk about the context of what's occurring in this space. And that's a context which is about ageing populations and ageing workforces. The second thing that I want to do is then open up the whole topic and talk about what is actually important to mature aged workers. So the core part of the presentation that I want to talk about is what is important for mature aged workers. And really there I want to answer three questions. The first one is, what do older workers value about work and why, given that more and more are staying on? The second question I want to answer, which is looking at some research that I've been doing over the last 4 to 5 years, is what's important to workers as they age at work? And then thirdly, we want to move to the whole area of health and life stages, and again, have a look at some of the statistics there, some of the data around some of the health concerns for older workers. I then want to pose a question for you, and this is something for you to reflect on, no doubt, as we're going through the webinar, and that is your wellbeing program in your organisation fit for purpose, fit for this changing environment? And then what we want to do is just finish out with Katrina coming back online and talking a little bit about integrating a life stage perspective into your wellbeing strategy. So let's first of all start by just posing the fact that over the last 6 or 7 or 8 years that I've been involved in this field, there's been absolutely no shortage of research. The reports continue to pile out, and anybody who follows me on LinkedIn will know that I regularly post articles from magazines, articles from newspapers, new research that comes out. But what I've observed is that there's a fundamental disconnect between a lot of the production of research, the production of documents and recommendations, and actual practice in the workplace. So what I want to do today is in this whole area of unpacking what's important to older workers is go from the research and link it through the practice for you. But first of all, let's have a look at something of the context and set the scene for this. And there's really two areas that we need to get to grips with. The first is aging population, the changes, significant changes that are happening in that space, and then aging workforces. So the first thing, I guess, when we look at changing population, and I'll take the Australian data in this case, is that there's been a significant change in terms of the shape of the population pyramid. And the statisticians have quite jovially in some ways called this, the population pyramid has changed from being a pyramid as it was in that first left-hand side in 1925 through to 2045. It's been speculated it will look more like a coffin. I've got a colleague who in actual fact used to work at Victoria University in Wellington, and she recalls that as she's aged, she now talks about this as moving from a pyramid to a cocktail shaker, which is more acceptable in her mind. But there's several things that you see going on within these population pyramids. The first is if you have a look at the 0 to 15 age group, you'll see that there's been a narrowing. So if you go back to 1925, the largest percentage of population in actual fact was aged 0 to 15. As we come through to 2000, that's no longer the case. You can see the largest population is sitting up there in the 40s and 50s. And as we know, that's the boomer bulge. Come through to 2045, the population has shifted significantly further up that pyramid. But the other thing that we notice that has changed there is also it's bumping through the top. And I guess what that's saying is that people are living longer. And longevity is one of the key things that we need to come to grips with in understanding what's happening around population aging. On the whole, we're living around 20 years longer than what we did 50 years ago. If we turn now to have a look at some of the numbers in Australia, what we find is in the 1970s, 8% of the population was aged over 65. Come through to 2010, you're up to 14% or around 3 million people aged 65 plus. 2030, 19%, 5.6%. 2049, 22%, that's 22 in every 100 people will be aged over 65. Hence the discussions that you get both in Australia and New Zealand and no doubt globally around the affordability of pensions. This here is an interesting diagram from Australia which basically shows the number of people turning 65 each week. So come through to 2012, 4,900, 2021, 5,500. And so on. So a significant number of people moving through to the 65 space in life. Now let's have a look and see what's happening in terms of the workforce. Increasingly, people ask, the second reason a number of people are staying on, and I think an increasing number will be staying on, is in actual fact for financial reasons. And that's the affordability of being able to live at this life stage. And then we find a third group who stay on at work, maybe sometimes beyond when they should or could be at work, and simply because they're frightened and they haven't thought about the next period in their life. Now, what is interesting in the data that I've put up on the screen there is in 2006 in Australia, 8% of the population over 65 are working, 2016, 13%. But jump across and have a look at the New Zealand numbers. 2006, we were sitting around about where Australia is now. In New Zealand, currently 25% of people 65 and over are working. We also know that 45% of people aged 65 to 69 are still in the workplace. And there's a number of reasons for the shift. Within the OECD, New Zealand ranks about number 2 in terms of participation of people over 55. Australia is ranking around about number 11, 12, having moved from number 14. But irrespective, globally, this is a trend that we're seeing of more and more people staying on at work. So hence, if they're staying on in your workplace, they're there in your workplace every day, we need to be asking the question, so what is it that is important for mature age workers as they age at work? What do old workers value about work and why? What is important to them as they age in place at work? And what are some of the health and life stage concerns that they have. What I want to do now is turn to, I guess, that first question is, what do older workers value about work and why? And I want to draw here on an international study from the Institute for Employment Studies, based out of the UK. It's an independent international research organisation that looks at human resource management issues. And what they were interested in was finding out what makes for fulfilling work for older workers. And the method they used was they scanned a whole lot of research, and they found something like 7,000 publications that had some relevance to the questions they were asking. They then whittled those down to have a look at 41 research studies that were relevant, they were robust in terms of their quality, and they asked these three questions. What do older workers value about work and why? How does this differ from the rest of the working age population? And what does this mean for the employer? And I'm going to recommend at the end that you Google this, or Katrina may well send out the link for you, because it's also a report that has a whole lot of recommendations that employers can take up. And it's a very recent report, 2017. But essentially, as they looked at the area of what makes work fulfilling for older workers, and they're talking about people 50 plus, they looked at three areas. The first area they looked at was the area of work content. And what they found there, by looking across all these studies, was that meaningful work that is interesting, stretches people, makes full use of their skills and experience, contributed to well-being and fulfillment within the workplace. The second thing they found was that older workers were looking for work that is varied and worthwhile. So don't give me work that doesn't contribute. Don't give me work that I can't see a connection to something that is bigger than myself. They were also looking for autonomy over how and when and what kind of tasks that they do. The second area that they then looked at was the area of work culture, which came through very, very strongly. So what people were looking for here was organisational cultures that are open, inclusive, places where their voices are heard, where what they want to contribute is valued in terms of the direction of the organisation. They also found in the research that the organisations who prevented and tackled any forms of discrimination and prejudice at all levels were the places where older workers wanted to work. And I'm going to come to a study later on that comes out of the University of Melbourne in South Australia. It's research that supports generational categories such as Gen X and Gen Y. So therefore, what we need to do is not start to use those terms in the workplace, but rather value people at different life stages. So then the third area that came through very, very strongly in the workplace was not just the need to be looking at work content and what people were doing, or to be looking at a culture that was inclusive and valued individuals, but also to be looking at some of the changes that need to be made in terms of the work that they were doing. So under this area, the things that came through very strongly in the research was people wanted full and equal access to occupational health and well-being support. And that again comes through in the research that I've done. They wanted appropriate physical adjustments to equipment and workplaces. So again, what we have coming through there is the whole thing around workplace design, around ergonomics, around tools, around equipment that people were using, and the adjustments are ongoing and needed there. And then thirdly, what they wanted was to see flexible working arrangements. And this again comes through time and time again in the research. And I think one of the interesting things around flexible work arrangements is we talk about it a lot, older workers ask for it, but there's recent research come out here in Australia in the last 4 weeks that shows in actual fact very, very few older workers are getting access to part-time work as they transition. So in terms of the work adjustments, when they dug a bit deeper into these 41 studies, what they found was that health had the largest effect on older workers' decisions about continuing to work over job satisfaction and job quality. So if the person was experiencing health difficulties, health challenges, or in a lot of cases, health challenges for their partners or those people around them, then that influenced their decisions about whether they'd stay, whether they'd leave, or whether they would be engaged in the workplace. And some of the health conditions that came through as being most significant for people were things like musculoskeletal conditions, stress, anxiety, things such as the prevalence of cardiovascular conditions, some deterioration in eyesight, muscle grip, postural and balance problems, as well as developing occupational challenges, cancers. So if we continue to move, have more complex and diverse needs, and some older workers may be experiencing multiple conditions. So the thing is that we always need to be looking for, we know this more and more in the whole area of aged care, is the existence of comorbidities. The second thing they found was that people in physical work, such as in construction, distribution, where there was lifting, where there was stress on the body, tended also to need assistive technology, new tools and new equipment to be able to help them in their work. The third thing they found was that often older women dropped out because often they were on lower pay, but also they felt greater stress levels, they felt socially isolated in the workplace, and this often contributed to the lack of fulfillment in the workplace. The fourth area where they saw risks existing, and this is one area where I often see it also too, is amongst highly skilled workers who are particularly keen to have control over what they do, how they contribute, and if they don't experience that in the workplace, then the risk is they may in actual fact disengage and stay, or they may in actual fact leave and take the initiative and set up their own business. The trend that we're seeing is the emergence of senior entrepreneurs in this space. So what do older workers value about work? Well, I guess the first thing that comes through, and I often say this from all of the studies, is what they're looking for is a workplace with some degree of flexibility and choice. The second thing they're looking for is a place where they can be valued and they can be doing valuable work. And then the third thing they're looking for is a work culture that embraces and recognises the contribution and the value that they bring. I want to now move to having a look at some research that I've been doing over the last 5 to 6 years. About 5 years ago, in the focus groups that I was running and also in the Explore workshops we run for mature age workers, I started administering a questionnaire which had 15 work preferences. And some of you may well have seen this if you've been part of workshops that I've done and some of the cluster programs. Thanks, Katrina. And what we've done here is we've asked participants to do two things. First of all, on each item, to rate it in terms of their importance to them. So if they put a 1, they'd say they've never thought about this option. 2, they're not interested even if the organisation offered it. 3, neutral, view either way. And the 2 scores I was particularly interested in was 4, they could be interested if this was offered, and 5, they'd welcome this option being in the workplace. So having rated each of the 15 items individually, we then asked them to select their top 3 priorities, those 3 things they would really want to see in their workplace. Now this has now been run, and we've got a database with something like 656 participants in it from a whole range of industries and sectors across both countries. In Australia, 411 responses, New Zealand, 245. So when we look at the top 7 scoring items, this is the items that scored the 4s and the 5s, it's really interesting to see what came up top. The first thing that came up top was that older workers were saying, we want access to advice to prepare for retirement. Now it's going to be interesting when we have a look at that in terms of the difference between Australia and New Zealand. The second thing they said, around about 77% of them said, we want access to health and wellbeing services and advice. And then thirdly, without going through all of them, 74% were saying they wanted to reduce to part-time work as they transitioned, and then they wanted challenging and interesting work. So those are the top 4 or top 7 on the screen from the database of 656. Now, if we come to Australia, what we find is advice to prepare for retirement is number 1. And there's a number of reasons for that, that I'll come to when I compare the 2 countries. But again, access to health and wellbeing services and reducing to part-time work. Now let's introduce the picture from New Zealand. Quite a different picture, and there's some very good reasons for this. What New Zealand respondents were saying was, number one is we want to do challenging and interesting work. Now bear in mind, we've got a much higher number of people over the age of 50, 55 staying on and work in New Zealand. And what they're saying to employers in that country is, we want to keep doing interesting and challenging work. Now this ties back to the previous study that we looked at. See where advice to prepare for retirement sits. Number 6, it's not up there. And the major reason for that is the complexity of the Australian system versus the lack of complexity in New Zealand. If you had a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of complexity around access to age pension and superannuation, Australia would rate at 10 in terms of complexity, New Zealand would rate at number 1. And that's a very significant difference between the two countries. But in both countries, people saying we want access to health and wellbeing services. Okay, now let's unpack this a little further. And let's have a look at what their priorities were. So this is where they sat down and they had to put down 1, 2, 3 priorities. And the weighting we did is that they had it as number 1 priority, it's got a weighting of 3, a number 2 priority, no, weighting of 2, and number 3 priority is weighting of 1. So that's just a bit of technical stuff behind the scenes. So what came up very, very clearly in the overall weighting score was people wanting to reduce to part-time as they transition. Absolutely was their top priority, and that would come through as a case in both countries. Secondly, access to prepare for retirement, and 3 and 4, again, looking at time-based options. So what's coming through here is access to advice and the ability to be able to manage time in quite different ways. But if you drop down to 5, 6, and 7, what you're seeing there again is some recommendations, some priorities around work content. Now let's unpack this a little further and have a look at Australia. Not surprising, reducing to part-time work as I transition is number 1. Number 2 is compressed working week. Number 3 is advice to prepare for retirement. So again, here what we find is people in Australian workplaces, the one we've surveyed, are saying, I want to be able to reduce, I also want to have access to good advice. Come to New Zealand, and the picture is the same at the top. In both countries wanting to be able to do transition, and as I said before, the research is coming out saying that employers are not offering this. They're not offering it in a way that is actually working for older workers. But again, you see advice to prepare for retirement dropping pretty near the bottom in terms of priorities. So what sense are we to make of all of this as we transition? So the differences between New Zealand and Australia. Well, the first significant difference is the history of superannuation. In Australia, superannuation has existed since the Keating government in 1992. There's been a mandatory employer contribution that has now moved through to 9%. In New Zealand, it's been voluntary since 2007 as KiwiSaver. The employees able to put in 3, 4, 8%, the employer 3%. So in New Zealand, we don't have that history of superannuation through the workplace that there is in Australia. The second thing that comes through quite differently in terms of the two countries is in New Zealand, we have universal entitlement to age pension. The only significant criteria that needs to be met is that you've got to have lived in the country for a period of time and you need to have reached the age of 65. After that, no questions asked. In Australia, income and asset tested. So huge complexity in Australia around age pension. The third difference is the retirement narrative, and I haven't got time to go into that, but I find it interesting working in both countries just to listen to the way in which people in both countries talk differently about retirement and where it figures in the national discourse. However, let's just come to the conclusions that come out of the survey. The first thing that comes through quite clearly is people are looking for flexibility. They're wanting time-based options. They're wanting to be able to transition. They want to manage their start-finish times. They want to be able to work compressed working weeks. And we know that flexibility is important for people at all life stages. But the clear message we're getting here to employers is we want flexibility. The second thing that comes through quite clearly from here is people are wanting access to advice. They want access to good advice in terms of financial advice, life stage advice, and also advice in terms of health and well-being. The third thing that people are looking for is they want good work content. They're saying we want challenging work with ongoing access to professional development and to be able to mentor others as we remain or transition from the workplace. So very, very clear message to employers from employees around the things that are important to them. Okay, what I want to do now is just step sideways for a couple of minutes and have a look at what are some of the health and life stage concerns of older workers, as first of all it comes through the literature and then from a very informal survey that I've been doing over the last month or so as I've talked to older workers. Back in 2016, Susan Ryan, the then Commissioner for Age Discrimination and Disability, released the Willing to Work inquiry here in Australia. And a number of key messages came through as she released that work, that report. The first thing that she identified was that poor health is the leading cause of premature and involuntary retirement. People are leaving the workplace early and often before they want to due to poor health. The second thing she found was that those who retire for health reasons do so earlier than those retiring for many other reasons. Now we see this in most countries. So people who exit early are often going into retirement prior to when they wanted to without the necessary savings or life stage adjustments in place that they would normally be wanting to have in place. She also found that older Australians with a self-rated status of fair or poor are more likely to exit the workplace earlier. So let's now have a look at some of the things, the projections that came through in the research that she surveyed. One of the things that she found was that by 2035, 1 in 4 men and 1 in 5 women in their 60s will have a self-reported health status of fair or poor. That's 20% of men, 20% of men, or 25% of men, 20% of women in their 60s rating themselves as fair or poor. Now, the interesting thing is we might say that's 2035. Let's roll back. Those people are in our workplaces now in their 40s. And we have an opportunity to reach them in terms of some very key messages around health and around well-being in the workplace. So in this group, 65% of men and 72% of women are likely to then be unemployed and out of work. And that has significant impacts for Australia in a number of key areas. First of all, a significant impact in terms of cost. It's a significant cost. Poor health will prevent 1 in 4 Australians from saving enough for their retirement. Now, just remember, we've also said that people are living longer. So it may well be that they're moving into a retirement phase earlier and for longer with less financial means. But there's a second thing is that she points out there's a significant cost to the economy in lost GDP from loss of participation by people aged 45 to 65 due to health conditions. And that loss to the economy, she figures, will be something like 60 billion by 2030. So the key message that's coming through here is that health and well-being in the workplace is critical now in terms of the future economy, the future of our workplaces and individuals' futures as we move forward. What I want to do now is just very quickly move into another area, and that's to talk about a study that's come out here in Australia, Australia's Health 2016. But before that, I've just slipped in a slide here, which I'm not going to talk about, but it comes from Ken Dykewell, who's one of the big thought leaders, I guess, in the area of age and gerontology. It's a slide that you can look at your own pleasure or maybe displeasure, because what it does is bring home to you some of the impacts of aging. Can be depressing if you look at it from an individual point of view, but it also starts to raise some of the things that are happening as people are aging at work. In 2016, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare released its 15th biennial report. It's just out, and there's two interesting aspects to that report that I want to have a look at. First of all, there's an essay in there which talks about the concept of the burden of disease. And then we also report some data from the ADS on self-reported health status. So if we have a look at this concept of the burden of disease, and I'm not going to go into it any in depth, you can Google it and look at it yourself. They basically talk about the burden of disease as being an analysis that quantifies the gap between a population's actual health and an ideal level of health in a given year. And there's a whole lot of factors that feed into that in terms of illness, injury, people dying prematurely. But if we have a look at this, and I've put the two lines across there between 45 and 69, there's three significant areas that emerge. The first area that emerges is cancers. The second area that emerges is cardiovascular conditions. And the third area that emerges is musculoskeletal conditions. So three areas with significant potential to improve the health and well-being of Australia's population. And while I don't have a similar study from New Zealand or globally, there's no doubt you'd see a similar picture happening probably in most Western countries. So if we drop this down now to having a closer look at it by age and gender, what we start to see is that there are some differences in terms of gender. So if we look at males, what we see quite clearly here is that the top burden in terms of health is coronary heart disease, followed by lung cancer, followed by other musculoskeletal back pains and other back-related problems. If we go to women, the top-rated one is musculoskeletal, followed by breast cancer, followed by back pain and problems associated with the back. So those are the top things that are coming through in this analysis for this particular age group. The Australian Bureau of Statistics in 2015 released its National Health Survey. Now this was a self-report and a self-select. But again, we see a similar pattern coming through there of people aged 45 to 64. In that what they were, so that's just a bit of background. So what are some of the things that older workers are concerned about? Over the last 3 or 4 months in New Zealand, I've been running a workshop called Life and Work After 50 for one of New Zealand's largest retailers. And we run it in 5 locations. And as I've sat and talked with them about the things that are concerning them, I've asked them a question. And the question simply has been, what are some of the health concerns that you think about and you worry about at this stage in your life? And what I want to do now is just walk through these. Now, purely anecdotal, but they'd probably be consistent with the same sort of questions that you ask. And I think this underlines the statement I often make, the importance of actually talking to your older workers, sitting down with them, asking them what's important to them. Well, what was interesting, across those 5 workplaces, menopause came up as number 1. And that wasn't just, by the way, women saying menopause was an issue that they were concerned about. It was men also saying, and making clear they work with women, they live with women, that menopause is certainly an issue that needs to be talked about a lot more. They talked about being able to manage their energy levels, a fatigue that came from working in retail, often being on their feet, often lifting. They talked about the loss of memory, walking to the back of the store to find a price and having forgotten it by getting to the front. And we talked about simple interventions like carrying a notebook. They talked about disturbed sleep patterns, diet, weight management, musculoskeletal, joints, aches, osteoporosis. They talked about mental health issues for themselves, often talking about anxiety, talking about depression and other things that was happening in their life. And this was an interesting one that came through, the whole issue around cancer. And what came through here was a number of people who talked about the fact that in the workplace they had to deal with the loss of a partner who had died, and how supportive the organisation was, but they were still needing to live with that and work through that situation as part of their well-being at work. But the other factor that came through was they may have had cancer and they were living in remission, or they were living with a partner who was in remission, and how that contributed to well-being. And then what came through again was the issue of loneliness, loss of purpose, and not having a sense of direction into the future. And then finally, the final one that came through was partners' health and parents' health. So these were just anecdotal comments, but they'd be the same sort of things that you would find if you were to go and talk to your workplace. Now let's return back and start to pull some of this together in terms of some of the health and wellbeing concerns. Back to Susan Ryan's report, a familiar list is now starting to emerge. Musculoskeletal concerns, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular, memory loss, hearing, vision, mental health. Return back to the Institute for Economic Studies report. And what comes through there is musculoskeletal conditions, stress and anxiety, a higher prevalence of cardiovascular conditions, deterioration of eyesight, muscle grip, postural balance problems, as well as developing occupational cancers. Now, what was interesting, going back to this retailer that I was working with, they had a conversation with me and they said, what are some of the things that we could do in our workplace to support our people around some of the physical changes that are happening? And what they're looking at is getting additional scissor lifts. So lifting equipment for cartons, for bags. They're looking at getting scissors and knives that are right for people with arthritic hands. All things, very, very simple things that employers can do. So let's now bring this together before we start heading out towards posing that final question of, are your wellbeing programs fit for purpose? So if we have a look down on the ageing side, where we've come to is to realise that people are in actual fact now living longer. People are in actual fact staying on in the workplace, and they're needing to work and they're wanting to stay in employment. And that is a changing phenomenon. What we're also finding is that employers will possibly need them. And that's because of declining birth rate following through behind the baby boomers. I don't know about the numbers here in Australia, but recently in New Zealand, numbers came out saying that New Zealand by mid-2030s is going to be around 200,000 people short in the service sector. And a lot of that service sector is going to be in the aged care sector. So employers are going to need their older workers in one way or another. But what also has come out as we've looked at ageing is age discrimination is impacting. It's impacting particularly for people who find themselves out of work and wanting to get back in, but it's also impacting for people who are in their workplace and experiencing age discrimination, as we know that disengagement can impact significantly on productivity. What we're also finding is that many employers, professions and individuals are simply unprepared for the changes that are happening around ageing in the workplace. So if we come across now and have a look at some of the summary points out of health, what we find is that 20 to 25% of people by 2035 in their 60s will have compromised health status unless we do something now. The second thing we find is that what's presenting now in the workplace around health issues are new and complex challenges for organisations. Increasingly, we're going to be finding in workplaces people who've got early onset of dementia, not something that we've necessarily had to deal with before in terms of both health, well-being, and also employment relations. The third thing that we've found and identified is that early withdrawal from work has long-term impacts for individuals, for society, and for the community. And some of those impacts are around social disconnectedness, health, and economic impacts. So the question I want to pose now is, are employees prepared, and does this really matter? Well, there's been research now in New Zealand, Australia, and in the US that shows very, very clearly that very few employers in actual fact have active, mature age workforce action plans in place. Recently in New Zealand, the Commission for Financial Capability did a survey, and what they found was that surveyed 500 companies, and only 83% didn't have any plans in place. That's only 17% had any sort of action plan in place. Now, this research that I've cited here from the University of Melbourne, I don't have time to go into it today, and it's a very complex document to read. But what I'd do is ask you to Google that title, and they've got a fantastic 3.5-minute YouTube that unpacks the research very much in layperson's terms. But what they were looking at that was the impact of stereotype threat. And what they found was that many companies had in place high performance practices. And you could be sitting here saying right now, in our company, we've got a best practice wellbeing program. What does it matter? Well, what they found was that just having high performance practices in place was insufficient to deal with the stereotype threat that many older workers experienced in the workplace. What you also needed to have in place were mature age practices that valued and recognised the place of mature age workers in the workplace. And so the question I guess I come to and pose before I pass this back over to Katrina is your workplace wellbeing program fit for purpose, not just for the current workplace where you're getting increasing numbers of older workers, but for the workplace of the next 10 to 15 years? So Katrina, what I'd like you to do now is hand over to you and ask you to make a few comments about, so what do you do about this? How do you integrate this thinking into your wellbeing program in a strategic way?
Great. Thank you, Geoff, and for setting the scene so beautifully for this part of the session. So as Geoff said, how do we target wellness interventions for employees at the different life stages, but I guess more specifically to today's topic, your mature age workers? Now, firstly, as Geoff's already outlined too, there's a lot of myths and misconceptions when it comes to mature age workers and health. And when it comes to designing a wellness strategy, that this includes for mature age workers, that often that they're higher risk employees within your workplace. Whereas in fact, research suggests that it's actually often the younger employees who engage in those riskier health behaviours, such as high alcohol consumption, such as smoking. Furthermore, also studies indicate, and Geoff alluded to this earlier, that Gen X, actually that Generation X, typically born between 1969 and 1980, depending on the definition, actually have higher rates of overweight and obesity and also diabetes compared to baby boomers at the same age, when they're at the same age. Hence, Gen X may age with a greater burden of disease and also have a poorer quality of life than previous generations. One of the other myths is that mature age workers often have high rates of injury, when in fact mature age employees typically have lower rates of injury, but when they do get injured it tends to be more severe in nature, and that's particularly the case for the likes of musculoskeletal injuries, which often can have a longer recovery time as well. Another myth that, again, mature age workers have high rates of absenteeism, when in fact research and literature suggests they actually have low rates of absenteeism, generally speaking, and tend to be more punctual. And also aren't technology savvy is often one that we encounter in our discussions with our clients, whereas in fact, again, research suggests that the fastest growing users of Facebook, that mature age employees love to research and consume content, the likes of webinars that we're doing today, videos and blogs. And given that approximately 86% of working Australians now have smartphones, I think is testament to that as well. So ultimately, from our point of view anyway, the core goals are the same for all generations. It's in essence that employees want to work for an organisation that cares for and supports their health and well-being. And having a safe and well-designed workplace will also decrease the risk of injuries and boost the productivity of all workers. So if we move into our next model, onto our 6-step wellness blueprint process. So when it comes to adopting a life stage approach to your wellness efforts, there's actually very little research or literature out there, surprisingly. However, in our view and in line with our proven 6-step model for developing a best practice program, we believe it comes down to really 3 simple principles. And this includes ensuring you determine what are the needs for your population. And as Geoff's referenced too, this includes, consultation with all levels of your workplace, including your mature age workers, as to what they need, but also what they are interested in. On the back of that, designing targeted interventions that are going to ensure you spend your time, money and resources in the right place. And I guess the key challenge, as the saying goes, nothing happens until people participate, and it's about how do you engage employees at those different life stages. Or in this instance specifically, does your strategy talk to your mature age workers? And I guess once you've determined those needs and interests of your employees, we need to look at adopting an integrated approach to health and wellness management within the workplace. So from an individual perspective, in essence, one size obviously doesn't fit all. And an individual's likelihood to make a positive health change is really going to depend on their personal health status. It's going to depend on their life course, their life stage. It's also going to depend on their readiness to change. Now, for mature age employees, this might include access to things such as age-specific screenings, the likes of colorectal screening, bone density screening, eye examinations, or also support. And Geoff mentioned earlier about the likes of cancer or grappling with relatives that may be impacted by cancer. And I know there's a lot of EAP providers, for example, that provide cancer counselling for individuals or family members in that regard. At a cultural level, how can you really ensure the norms, values and climate of the organisation really support, the health and well-being of your people? So that can extend to things such as positive role modelling by your senior leadership team, or as a simple example, having the likes of workplace challenges that are inclusive and that help build that team cohesiveness and morale. At environmental level, again, how can we make those healthy choices the easy choices for our employees? So that might include, again, some simple examples such as ensuring adjustable seating, of workstations, of proper lighting, of ensuring there's opportunities for exercise and stretch breaks and the like. And finally, at a policy level, how can we integrate health and wellness into the DNA of the organisation so it does become that business as usual? So that can include things like flexible working to accommodate whether it be medical care, preventative health appointments, elder care responsibilities as well. And I know there's companies such as Lend-Lease Australia, New Zealand, who've introduced recently 3 days of wellbeing leave in addition to their usual leave entitlements, which employees can use for a range of activities, whether it be a yoga retreat, a meditation course, or a preventative health check or carer's respite. And what we know is when we adopt that integrated approach to health and wellness across the life stages, that some of the key outcomes firstly include an increase in workability. Now, for those that might not be familiar with that term, that was a term coined by the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health. And it looks at what are people's both physical and mental capacity, particularly as they get older, to perform the job required. And what they found is that when you looked at the different approaches to health, safety and wellness management within the workplace, you can see there was a decline as people got older where there was no action, and decline in workability. Where a health promotion approach was adopted, that certainly helped fend that off somewhat, but it really showed the importance of that integrated approach that not just centred on the likes of health promotion, but also looked at the broader environmental and cultural piece as well. Obviously, some of the other outcomes, the benefits around retention of quality and experienced employees and extension of working life, extending to things such as productivity, obviously job satisfaction, engagement, reduction in the likes of workers' compensation costs, and I guess also most critically, company reputation and being known as a great place to work. And just finally, I guess it's really tapping into that WIFM factor. That's what's in it for me. And certainly determining what the needs and interests are important. But as the saying goes, nothing happens until people participate. And the key to really maximising that engagement in your wellness efforts is to really tap into that WIFM and have a really good understanding, as Geoff has outlined so beautifully, as to what are some of the key challenges, what are the priorities for employees at different life stages, and how can what you are offering potentially solve that problem for them. So if we look at financial wellness in the workplace as a simple example, there was a recent study done, the Financial Fitness of Working Australians, by a group called Map by Plan. And what they found is that baby boomers were most interested in retirement planning, Gen X were in retirement planning and investment planning, and Gen Y in investment planning and budgeting, or more day-to-day management. So again, this is going to come back to your needs assessment and really looking at targeting strategies aligned to your audience. And it really begs the question, I guess, does your current wellness strategy talk to your mature age employees? And it might be centering on things like physical and mental strengthening through workplace yoga or strength training to enable them to continue with the job they love or be able to, play with their grandkids. So again, identifying and tapping into that WIFM factor. And I just want to provide very quickly, as I am conscious of time, just what I think is a really good case study of where it's been very cleverly packaged and positioned, which has been very generously shared by Ramsay Healthcare for today's webinar. And what they've done is identify that employees at different life stages do have different needs, and they've also tried to highlight for employees at different life stages the range of benefits that are available for them to support them at those different stages. So for the likes of graduate nurses that might be coming into the organisation, providing things like access to preceptors or mentoring, and also pointing them to some resources and benefits that might be helpful at the start of their employee journey. They also have a program called 50 Plus, which again centres, as you can see the tagline there, we know there's more to life than work. And again, what they've done is not only highlight benefits that were already available that employees in that life stage mightn't have already been aware of, but also based on feedback and input from their employees, have also included a range of tailored offerings, including things like flexible leave, the likes of grandparents' leave. They have special health and wellbeing interventions, including access to health checks and screening, discounts to certain providers, and also things like on-site access to financial providers, and a discount to National Seniors Group as well. So I just wanted to share that as a little bit example of how, again, because often what I find is a lot of employees don't actually know what's already on offer to support them at their different stage. And I thought this was just a nice quote to end on for this section. U.B. Blake, who was an author, if I knew I was going to live this long, I would have taken better care of myself. So I guess it's about for employees at the different stages. So again, looking at how as an organisation we can support not only their health and wellbeing of their quality of life, but also an extension of that, their families as well. So with that, we're going to open it up to questions. And Geoff, I'm just going to field some of those for you. And we've had one question come through from Liz, who's asked, Geoff, how can employers stay ahead of the seniorpreneur movement with collaborative work hubs? So that's an interesting one, Liz. Geoff, do you have any thoughts on that one? I'll just read that again. How can employers stay ahead of the seniorpreneur movement with collaborative work hubs?
I'm not sure what you're driving at there, Liz. And if it's a lizard, I'm thinking, oh, thanks for tweeting while we've been going through this presentation. That's really appreciated. Certainly, the trend towards senior entrepreneurship is a global trend. And I think if we go back into the research I cited, if employers are wanting to stay ahead of it, then they've got to create a work culture that has older workers who have that entrepreneurial flair wanting to stay with their employer. And creating an environment where at that life stage they can feel as if they're still contributing, they're making a difference, they're doing work that's really interesting while still being within the employment environment. As we saw from the IAS study, if they don't, people with those sort of skills, their orientation are going to flick out and move into, in actual fact, establishing businesses of their own. And that may be a good thing, it may not be, but I think that's what your question was probably asking.
Great, thank you, Geoff. I've had another question come through, Geoff, as well, saying on the 60 Minutes program on Sunday night, it was suggested that the future may well see us retiring the concept of retirement and people having to work till they drop. This obviously has implications for employers and individuals, and what is your take on this? Geoff, do you have any thoughts around?
Yeah, I do, and I watched that program afterwards and reflected on it. I think a number of things. I think what it was doing, there's a potential for a program like that to be scary and to be scaremongering and to frighten a lot of people into thinking that they'll never be able to retire. And what we find is that when we run our Explore workshops and start to unpack something of the complexity that exists here in Australia, that numbers of older workers in actual fact find they can. They don't need $1 million. to be able to retire or $1.5 million. You'd be thinking about, as an actual fact, providing good opportunities for people simply to explore what the future is about and getting good information. I think the longer at work, and I've actually said, I think in 20 years' time, the concept of retirement will be gone, but not because of that. I think it's because we are living longer. We're rethinking that last stage or next stage in our lives. We want to stay and work. We want to continue to contribute. We might not want to work in the same way we have in the past, but we're reconstructing what that 60 plus period, the 60 through 70, 75 period in our life is. So I guess that's my take on it, that a documentary like that can be scary, it can be frightening, although it had some very good case studies in it. But on the other hand, we are living longer, and I think we need to embrace the opportunity that's there for us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Geoff. And I'm just conscious of time, so thank you for those questions through. And what I'll do now is get Geoff to talk to our next program coming up, which is the Ageing Workforce Cluster.
It's been great to talk with people today. Coming up here in Brisbane, we're starting in August one of our Ageing Workforce Strategy Builder Cluster programs. We've run about 6 of these in Tasmania. I previously run some here in South East Queensland, but it's an opportunity for an employer to sit down and over 3 months to develop an evidence-informed strategy of their own that will set them up for that future with an ageing workforce. It's 3 4-hour workshops, there's tasks to do in between. And I guess one of the things about this is at the end of that, you also get 2 hours consulting in your workplace, where we'll come and work with you around implementing what that strategy and action plan might look like. So while we've got one starting in Brisbane, we've got another one starting in Tasmania, and currently we're discussing starting a cluster in Wellington in New Zealand. But we'd be open to, in actual fact, running these clusters wherever there's 6 to 8 employers who want to sit down, work together over a 3 to 4 month period and develop an action plan. Thanks very much, Katrina.
Great, thank you, Geoff. And I'd just like to acknowledge and thank you to Geoff for his contribution to today's Wellness Wise webinar series. We hope you certainly walked away with some practical takeaways and also a few aha moments that you can go away and continue the conversation back in your organisations. I'd also just like to make brief mention of the next webinar coming up in our series around building a mentally healthy workplace, which will be facilitated by the wonderful Rachel Clements, who's also part of our expert wellness advisory group, who's from the Centre for Corporate Health. So we hope you can join us for that also. And also just to finish up, again, if you were interested in finding out more about Wellness Design Services and or Wellness Wise Academy, we'd certainly love to connect with you further. And also just to wrap up today's webinar, we would also love to hear your feedback on today's webinar and any ideas for future topics. Again, we'd love those to share you with us. So thank you to Geoff, thank you to our participants from today, and we hope to see you at the next webinar series.
Thank you.